Good evening. I'm Nigel Redden, the General Director of Spoleto Festival USA, and I want to welcome you to the second in our series of panels entitled Exploring Omar. These discussions are intended to explore the world of Omar Ibn Said, the highly educated African who was enslaved in 1807, transported to Charleston, and sold. He wrote his autobiography in 1831, perhaps the only enslaved person in the United States to do so while still enslaved. He died in 1863, still enslaved. Spoleto Festival USA has commissioned an opera based on his story, composed by Rhiannon Giddens and Michael Abels, with a libretto by Rhiannon Giddens, that is to premiere on May 28th at the beginning of the 2021 Spoleto Festival USA, and is the latest in a series of projects initiated by the festival to examine aspects of Charleston's history, and by extension, the history of the United States. There are many things I found moving on reading Omar Ibn Said's autobiography, but what most surprised me was that as a Muslim, he was one of what scholars say were as many as 30% of the Africans enslaved in this country who are Muslim. This evening's discussion will focus on the connection between the low country of South Carolina and Senegal. Omar Ibn Said was born in Futa Toro, a small land in the northern part of what is now Senegal. We are lucky to have Michael Allen moderate this discussion. He was a long-time National Parks Department ranger who has immersed himself in South Carolina's history. He is often called the father of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, which celebrates the low country culture with such strong ties in Africa. I'll ask Michael to introduce this evening's panelists. Michael.
And again, good evening, and thank you, Nigel, for that introduction. We're looking forward to a very spirited conversation. We're looking forward to a very engaging conversation. And we're looking for just an opportunity to talk about the life of Omar and how it not only connects with us today, but how his life is also understanding of our African-American, African connection. And so again, I'd like to say thank you for this opportunity to be with you this afternoon. If I can, I'd like to know where folks are joining us from today. You know, it's good to have some type of sense of where, from a geographical perspective, where people are joining us on this call. So if you don't mind, you can just share in the chat box what country, city, community, state that you may be visiting from. I think that's important for us to know. So if you don't mind, we welcome you to do that. So we have someone here from the low country of Charleston. So thank you very much for being here today. We're grateful for your presence and your participation. All the way from the great state of Michigan. Again, thanks for coming and being a part of us. Maryland, great. Thank you. Raleigh, more folks from the low country, North Carolina. That are here with us today out of New York City. That's important to know. Thank you for coming and being with us here. Great. I continue to see other locations around the nation and around the world. Great. Senegal's with us from the upstate of South Carolina, New York. Great. Well, as I see in our geographical conversation here today, I want to leave and begin this journey here with two words. One is called enslavement, and the second one is called slavery. And I think for the purpose of our discussion here today, I think it's very important that we use these two words as a defining word for the remaining part of our conversation. When I began to look at the word enslavement, it tells me that enslavement is a noun, and it's a form of the verb enslave. In other words, it's telling us that someone has been made to have been enslaved when you use the word enslavement. And then when we began to look at the word slavery or slave, it's a name of a system in which someone has been placed into. So I think understanding the word enslavement as well as slavery will be very important here this afternoon for our conversation. I'd like to take this opportunity now to actually let you know who the other panelists are with us that will be joining us in this lively discussion between two lands. First, Dr. Mamarame Seck, who will be joining us all the way from Senegal. I know it's a different time period and time zone of which you in, Dr. Seck, but again, I thank you for being with us here. I guess for you in the morning and for us in the evening. Dr. John Cropper, who is joining us from here in the Low Country, here in Charleston. So again, we thank you for being a part of this conversation. And also for Dr. Veronica Gerald Floyd, who is joining us from Conway, South Carolina. So again, to all of our three panelists from different parts of the globe, different parts of the great state of South Carolina, and different parts of our continent, we do say good evening and welcome today. If I can, I would like to ask John to maybe bring some context, and Nigel hit upon it earlier about Omar's arrival, the fusion, his experience, and I think that can be a foundation for the continuation of our conversation, John.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Michael. And thanks to all of you panelists. In the last few weeks, we've had a lot of robust discussions about this topic. It's been really enjoyable to get to know all of you. So thanks for sharing this virtual stage with me tonight. So before we jump in to the possible ways in which Omar was captured and enslaved, I thought it might be appropriate to offer some context where he was born and where he was raised, and also the time and place in which he lived. So Futatoro is situated along the Senegal River in what historians often refer to as the Middle Senegal Valley, which is a fertile region in northern Senegal where local populations practice floodplain agriculture and trade and graze livestock. Most of their trading was with the Wolof states to the west, which is obviously in present-day Senegal, and then, of course, to the north with the Moors and Berbers, which is part of present-day Mauritania. So the state of Futa Toro stretched along a narrow corridor of the Senegal River, spanning a length of about 250 miles from east to west, and only 15 miles from north to south. So it was a pretty narrow band of territory along the river. But most importantly, Futa Toro served as one of the most reliable breadbaskets of the Senegal River Valley. Due to floodplain agriculture, the populations of Futa Toro experienced two separate harvests, which is key in a pretty semi-arid region in Africa. So they would experience one after the rainy season from June to October, and then another during the dry season, typically around March. While floodplain agriculture enabled the inhabitants of Futa Toro to endure periods of drought and famine, it also made them vulnerable to political rivals. During times of scarcity and food shortages, which often happened in the semi-arid zone of the Sahel, warriors from the Wolof states and surrounding polities raided local villages of Futa Toro for surplus grains and livestock, as well as potential captives that they would later enslave. So at the time of Omar's birth in 1770, the Senegal Valley experienced a pretty volatile period of political, economic, and climactic instability. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, which we all might be familiar with, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, the French and British fought over access to and control of the Senegal River, which seriously disrupted trade between Futa Toro, the Wolof states, and Saint Louis, which was a commercial hub located at the mouth of the Senegal River. Along with the disruptions to trade, a series of droughts and famines pushed rival states to the brink of starvation. These states, including the Wolof and Berber kingdoms, raided the villages and communities of Futa Toro for grains and slaves. In the late 1770s and early 1780s, extended periods of drought led to an increase in slave trading. And in a span of few months, one British officer recorded that 8,000 people were captured, enslaved, and sold into the transatlantic slave trade. So you can kind of get an idea of how climactic and economic and political instability oftentimes produced vast amounts of enslaved peoples for European traders along the coast. And so moving now to the topic of slavery as an institution in Africa, and more specifically in Senegambia, there are lots of different ways in which scholars have interpreted the institution of slavery in Africa. But to make things simple for us, because we could talk about this for days, and get into the nitty-gritty of all the lived experiences of enslavement and slavery, I'm going to offer just a brief narrative of how the institutions of slavery in Africa, and more specifically in Senegambia, changed over time. So prior to the transatlantic slave trade, and perhaps even during its early years, the majority of African pre-colonial states, including Futa Toro, practiced a form of kinship slavery, which essentially required an enslaved person to assimilate into their master's households. Usually captives of war, or less frequently the victims of the raiding and pillaging of political rivals, enslaved people often lived and worked in the same manner as their masters. And it wasn't atypical for European slave traders or other Africans to mistake a free person for an enslaved person. So in the Senegal Valley, many enslaved people were put to work in the fields and the domestic sphere, but it was also important to note that there was really no severe class distinction between masters and enslaved peoples. They lived similarly, and in many ways, they lived equal lives in terms of economic possibilities and social possibilities. Moreover, some slaves became quite rich and powerful. Some served as political clients and consultants of the ruling elite, while others served as soldiers and generals in their kingdoms and their state's military, which in the Senegambia, among the Wolof kingdoms, we refer to these, what we call slave soldiers, you could say, as the Cheikh warriors. And many of the Cheikh warriors actually possessed enslaved people themselves and used their vast resources to accumulate wealth and power. So in other words, being an enslaved person in Futa Toro or in Africa more broadly was not one's defining characteristic. It was just one piece of a much larger identity. So as I mentioned, there was not a class of slaves, nor was there a universal experience of slavery and oppression. And indeed, enslaved people were socially and economically mobile. They could marry and have families, they could earn money and accumulate wealth, and many even possessed more privileges than freed persons. But it is also important to note, however, that their status as enslaved people also meant that they could be bought and sold, even if they were political and socially important to their pre-colonial states or their communities. So there are times where you see in the archive where the ruling elite traded prominent slaves to the transatlantic slave trade as a form of punishment or for a crime or a punishment for an act of betrayal. So even if you were a prominent enslaved person within these states, right, there was still a reminder that even though you were a very important person at that particular time and place, you could still be traded to the transatlantic slave trade and be shipped away from your home and from your family. So by the 18th century, however, kinship slavery changed quite significantly as the transatlantic slave trade reached its apogee, with more than 6 million Africans captured and sent to the New World. For most historians, the growth of the transatlantic slave trade transformed the institution of slavery in Africa from what we might consider a somewhat benign institution to something far more predatory. So attracted by the economic possibilities of profiting from the slave trade, many African elites tailored their economic systems to the demands of European slave traders, and thus created a much more predatory form of slavery than that of, as I mentioned, kinship slavery. So in Senegal in particular, the slave trade promulgated a widespread sense of insecurity that aggravated social conflicts and created a prolonged period of economic stagnation. So it is within this context then, going back to Omar Ibn Said, in which he was captured and sold into slavery in Futa Toro. In 1797, when Omar was approximately 30 years old, the Wolof state of Kayor defeated Futa Toro's army through a scorched earth military campaign. In the aftermath of the defeat, the political elite installed a new leader who attempted to regain Futa Toro's position as a military power. Yet after a series of military campaigns in the early 19th century, Futa Toro collapsed and a number of local oligarchs centralized political power and economic control. According to some historians, Ibn Said was captured and sold into slavery during one of these military campaigns. As was typical with most captives of war, Omar was likely traded to San Luis and boarded a slave ship bound for Charleston in approximately 1807. And finally, it is likely that Omar fell victim to a wealthy class of mixed-race slave traders in San Luis, known as the Señores. And I believe we might have an image of the Señores that we could possibly show to everyone. These women, who frequently married French and European traders, inherited their wealth after their husbands died or after their husbands returned back to France to return to normal life. So these women, these señores, inherited vast amounts of wealth over their lives. And because of their mixed race heritage, they could also speak European and African languages. And they were often the kingpins of commerce, including the slave trade throughout the Senegal Valley. They often had trade runners running up and down the river in different kinds of river boats, which we call pirogues. And they also negotiated frequently with European slave traders as well as African slave traders. So in a sense, these women were quite remarkable. And in other words, they ran the show of the transatlantic slave trade in the trading town of San Luis. And while we don't know definitively whether he was traded through one of the trading houses of the Señores, it is a distinct possibility that that might have been his point of departure when he headed across the Atlantic.
Well, John, thanks for at least painting that picture and giving us a foundation of Omar. I want to reach out to Dr. Seck. From your vantage point, being in Senegal with us on this call this evening and early morning for you, can you maybe paint a picture of Omar in terms of his faith, his challenges, his life, and his landscape in Senegal, to bring some more understanding of us, of him tonight, please?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, John, for this interesting overview of the situation within which slavery did exist in the region, and also the context within which Omar was captured. I like the idea of drawing a line between domestic slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. I think those two need to be differentiated, separated a little bit. So domestic slavery, as you said, did exist, pre-existed to Atlantic slave trade, but was not violent. It was something that actually the slaves were part of the social stratification. So you have people who were captured after battles, that became slave of a kingdom, of a king. So they lived and they were under the protection of the kingdom and the kings. So then came the Atlantic slave trade. Obviously, when it comes to this enterprise, so domestic slaves are the most vulnerable. So, and that's how some of them became, sold. But beside that, there were also some capturing of people randomly that were taken out of the land. So, and John also mentioned the instability of the region, and for that I would like to mention the Toro revolution that came in 1776. When Omar was 6 years old. So that was a period where Muslims were protected, were under the protection of the Toro, leaders. So one of the reasons why this revolution happened was actually to stop the enslavement of Muslims. That take us to the notion of enslavement, which is, you know, the act, but also the process of making someone into slave. So, and also be sold to Europeans who came at that time to seek for slaves. So the Toro movement did a great job of stopping, you know, this phenomenon. But as he said, when the Almami Abdel Kader Khan was defeated by the Cayor kingdom and put into prison there, and then freed later on, when he came back to the Futatoro, he settled in the south, in the Bundu area where he was originally from. And his assassination seems to coincide with the capturing of Umar. So, but the question that I'm asking, which also brought me to this interest in working on this project, but also on Umar, is whether Umar was actually from that region originally or from up north in the island of Morpheo. So I think that needs to be looked into, because you know, we don't know, because in his manuscript he mentioned, you know, the fact that he was from an area between the two rivers, which can be, you know, in the island of Morpheo, but also could be in the south between the Faleme River and the Gambia River, which might be also the place where he was transported from. Because, as we know, if we go by the date, you know, when Abdel Kader Khan was killed, it was in April 1907, and we all know that during that time, as John mentioned it, the river decreased, you know, and the shipping, you know, the ships cannot go from Saint Louis to that area in the south. So that means the other way around might be through the Gambia River. So it is possible that Umar was shipped from that area, you know, through the Gambia River, and we don't know whether they, as he mentioned, you know, whether he passed by Saint Louis or he was shipped directly from the Gambia. So those are the things that historians need to look at to kind of determine where exactly Umar was from and what was his itinerary, you know, through this journey that took him to Charleston.
Oh, if we can we maybe highlight this through a map, first of all, that shows the diffusion of Africans? First, the map of Senegal, which highlights what Dr. Seck just shared with us in the Gambia. And then from there, maybe a larger iteration of a map that shows that transatlantic flight, if you will, transatlantic slave trade, that shows the number of Africans that were taken, how they were diffused, and how this became what we call today the diaspora. I think that's important because often folks may not all be well versed as to the number of people that were enslaved, that were taken from the continent of Africa, perhaps where they were taken, and how this has now affected the landscape, whether it's in North America, Central America, or South America. So I think this map here is very keen and very important. And as we transition into our next segment, if we can bring up that image showing this is Sullivan's Island, I think that sets us up for the next part of our conversation. This historic plaque that we see here was erected in 1999 on Sullivan's Island, which is in the harbor of Charleston today, and is from this island that you have their rivals, the diffusion, and potentially, possibly Omar and others as they headed into North America. History tells us that in 1808, the United States banned the importation of Africans into the U.S. in 1808 as part of the Constitution. So it's ironic that when we look at Omar arrived in 1807, a year before the legal ending of bringing captive Africans into the world, or into North America, and specifically into South Carolina. And so we want to use that as a way to talk about Omar and the connections that existed between his homeland, as you also clearly described to us here tonight, in the Senegambia region, and his experience and what he saw in the landscape here in Charleston, here in the Low Country. So maybe Dr. Seck, you can go first and talk about food and that interconnection, and we'll ask John and Veronica to chime in as well.
Thank you. I think there is a lot of connections that can be made between the landscape where Omar was from and Charleston. So I think John mentioned earlier the fact that people in the Futatoro region, they kind of relied on the dual cycle of the river. So when the river valley is known for its agricultural activities thanks to the high flow of the river. So during the decrease of the river, the Futanke grow millet, beans, and corn. But during the rainy season, as he said, corresponding to the increase of the flow, they grow the small millet. So I think I mentioned some tools that they used for agricultural activities, and the most prominent one was the daba, which is a West African tool that is used largely in the region. So rice was considered a luxury food and was cooked during important ceremonies and holidays. So the indigenous people, ate corn and couscous prepared with the sumal millet. So, and the river valley also used to feed the coastal cities such as Saint Louis. The Saint Louisians, as we call them, used to buy millet, rice, beans, ivory, and leather. And in return, they sold cotton fabrics and glass jewelry. So the Wolof live north in the Futatoro at the borders with the Wallo near Dagana. I think we saw Dagana on the map earlier. And while the Halpular occupy the middle, like from Jum and Podor until Matam. And then you have the Sarahole Usoninkes who lived among the Halpular. They are the one working on rice fields. So today there are multiple examples of connections between Africa and the African American communities. And I wanted to, as a linguist, I will start with my field, which is linguistics. So to mention some similarities between Ebonics and African languages, for example, as we know, in African languages, agreement features are suffixed or prefixed or infixed to the pronominal subject and determinants, but rarely to the root verbs and nouns. For example, in Wolof, the agreement goes to the class marker. For example, if I say hale bi, hale is the word for child, bi is the determinant, the article. So hale bi and is the child, but hale yi is the children. So you see that the agreement feature goes to the article, the determinant, and not on hale, which is the root, the noun. So what does it mean? It means that if you look at formal English dialect, like numbers, and say 1 book, 2 books, 3 books, 5 books, in Ebonics, you may hear 1 book, 2 book, 3 book, 5 book without any agreement. That also when it comes also to verbs, you all know that in English, you would say, I have, you have, he has, we have, you have, they have. But in Ebonics, you may hear, I have, you have, he have, we have, you have, etc. So that means there is no agreement on the verb, but on the pronoun will tell us about the number and maybe the gender. And even in the syntax of Ebonics, when in formal English, one would say, for example, when he left, he gave me no reason why. In Ebonics, that we would get something like, when he left, he didn't give me no reason why. So just like this example as well, this fellow did not tell anyone anything, and then you would hear in Ebonics, this fellow didn't tell nobody nothing. So this double negation is prominent in African languages. So in the food, I think we also know that today you would see jollof rice, which is known as chebujan in Wolof, jambalaya, which has its also corresponding dish, mbahal in Wolof. You have the gombo dish, it's called supu kanja here. So those are food that we share with the African American community. As for the hairstyle, we can talk about the cornrows for both men and women. The Senegalese twist called Rasta here, the jewelries, the dreadlocks, etc. So I think those are elements that we can mention as connections between South Carolina, the African American community in general, and West Africa.
And I think with that, Dr. Seck, I want to kind of bring in John, if I can, again, ask him to look at this from an environmental perspective in terms of the landscape, in terms of the similarity from Senegambia region to the Low Country, because I think that's important for the continuation of the culture and history.
Yeah, of course. So along with, I'm a professor of modern history here at the College of Charleston, of modern African history, I should say. And I also study environmental history, so I'm very fascinated by questions of how the environment relates to human beings and the shared history between the two. And before we jump into like the similarities between the Low Country and Senegambia, I think it's also important to note that along with the transatlantic slave trade as really a business of moving human beings from one place to another for enslavement in the New World, a lot of flora, fauna, and biota traveled along with both the Europeans and the enslaved Africans. And so what we call this is this idea of the Columbian exchange, which really starts, as we all know, in 1492 with Christopher Columbus. And we have this kind of exchange of not just human societies and cultures, but also of the different kinds of environmental and ecological elements that these peoples brought together. And so you kind of have an exchange in the form of, devastatingly for the New World, you had smallpox and measles and mumps and things that completely devastated populations. You also had the introduction of sugar, and you had the introduction of coffee and other really important crops that became kind of part and parcel of the plantation economies throughout the New World. But then you also had the reverse happen, right? You had a lot of New World plants making their way back to Africa as well as Northern Europe. Tomatoes and potatoes are two of the most well-known New World crops that then proliferated in the Old World, especially in places like Ireland and Italy in those cases. But in Africa in particular, cassava and maize became staple grains and staple crops for communities throughout West Africa, and maybe you could even say for lots of sub-Saharan Africa today. So these long historical connections of flora, fauna, and biota are still alive and well today. So it's, next time you eat one of these things, kind of understand the large world connections that are at play. But more specifically for the Low Country, you know, there are dishes down here that people feast on every day and don't realize their roots. And we have some amazing chefs in Charleston. And if you're not from Charleston, when you can get on a plane, come down and enjoy the great food. But things like gumbo and hop and john are two classic dishes that actually have roots in the Senegambia, right? And some chefs, I think Sean Brock, who is the chef of Husk, actually did a study of foodways from Charleston back to Senegal, and met a few Senegalese chefs, and they cooked together and discussed the incredible connections between the Low Country and Senegal. And it's also really important, of course, for people who live down here to discuss the kind of long and dark history of rice cultivation, simply because rice was the primary cash crop for the Low Country, and it really is what sustained the slave society, you could say, of Charleston. And interestingly enough, right from the outset, when people arrived here in 1670 from Barbados, South Carolinians already had 100 slaves, 100 captives with them when they arrived here in Charleston. And even though there isn't much in the way of records of rice cultivation taking off right away, by 1690 it was quite prolific. And so that kind of demonstrates that, you know, you don't start growing rice overnight. It takes time for these things to develop. So rice became a serious crop for the settlers here very early on in the late 17th century. And that's not because white Europeans were trying to grow rice. It's because many of the enslaved people that arrived with those white Europeans were from places like Sierra Leone, the Senegambia, Guinea, places that do, you could say that are technical experts in rice growing. And so not only do you have this early evidence of rice and its importance to South Carolina, but then you also see African techniques of rice growing here in South Carolina. So if you were to compare certain regions of the Low Country, like low tide rice cultivation, you can find that in certain parts of Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and other parts of West Africa. And it's really no coincidence that Africans were bringing their expertise with them, and white slave traders knew that they had this expertise. And if you do a quick Google search of slave market advertisements, in Charleston, you will see these classic images of advertisements for enslaved Africans in Charleston in the 17th century, 18th century, and it will say Africans from the River Gambia. Or it will say, enslaved people are slaves with an expertise in rice growing and cotton growing. And so that, the slave traders knew their market, and they knew that it was smart for them to advertise the expertise of their enslaved people to the planters of Charleston. So we have this incredible legacy of African foodways here in Charleston. And even though slavery is a completely dark and deplorable history, the silver lining of anything of this is the beautiful culture and amazing cuisine and amazing things that have come to define who we are as an American society. And so things that we can look proudly on today in terms of cultural assimilation.
Well, when we begin to look at what Mamarame shared and John, I want to ask you to chime in, Veronica, please, to talk about first from the political aspect, how does Omar Ibn diffusion ties into the politics of the time period? And then from there, I think you can draw a line into the culture, into the tourism, and from a modern perspective of where we are now in the 21st century, please.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And I really enjoyed the other comments. One thing that I think we don't necessarily look at in totality is the fact that there were so many things that were in common with what was being done in Africa and what was being done on this side of the Atlantic. I think that commonality really strengthened all of what people are finding fascinating today about us as Gullah Geechee people, I think what happened is that we're the same. People were afraid. People were unaware that the continuity would be the connecting chain that would produce an Omar and the Gullah Geechee people on this side that he was a part of when he was brought to Charleston. People don't see that these kinds of connections is what we need to look at in terms of enslavement and slavery. When you look at what went on in the States, my family goes back in South Carolina to the 1700s. Most of us do that were associated with rice cultivation because it was such a skilled crop in the process that there wasn't a lot of trading of slaves from the rice plantations because you had trained labor. So many people stayed, as my people did, on Brook Green Plantation. The history goes all the way back. It's not a whole history of people moving from Brook Green. They may have moved to another plantation that was owned by the same rice grower, but the umbrella was very tight. So that consistency that he came into when he came to the Carolinas, he helped with a generation of slaves to produce a solid, consistent kind of culture that did not discard rice. It introduced jollof in South Carolina style. It did not discard the healing practices, the beliefs and practices. And as we look at Islam in South Carolina alone, one of the most absent in historic and scholarly activity is looking at, yes, there was a large Islamic population. In the Gullah Geechee community that I grew up in, we still had people who had Islamic tendencies. We didn't understand it at the time. We knew that they did certain things on Fridays. They always covered their heads. They always prayed different times of the day, but we didn't understand. But that was in my time period, still seeing these people. What happened after we started on this side of the Atlantic is that the cash crop that John talks about became the indicator of how enslavement would be handled. The whole idea, and I said it, I quoted, included a quote from John Henry Clark that talked about how the enslavers knew early on that Africa was a core, that it was a consistency. They saw it because they were back and forth and looking at different Africans coming into the country. Africa is like a heart, is considered the heartbeat of any people that came out of Africa. But most importantly for this conversation, we're looking at the Senegalese, we're looking at people who came from the Senegambia region. That whole area was heavily trafficked for slaves, and people figured prominently in the slave population. The men dated Tembe, the Wolof, they figured prominently, and so did their foodways, so did their burial customs, so did their beliefs and practices, root work magic, all of that was consistently the same and still works like that today. Zora Neale Hurston said something in 1933 that I remember specifically. She said, "Shreds of hoodoo and voodoo can be found wherever Africans live on the earth." People think when you come to the South, you're going to find a different thing. When you go to the North, you're going to find a different thing. But what happened is that certain elements from all of these tribal groups kind of meshed together to form something very inclusive of all of the groups. I think that one of the things I wrote down that I wanted to make a point about is today what we call the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor, from about Wilmington, North Carolina to St. Augustine, Florida. That particular corridor is still, even to this day, dictated by a cash crop. Today, that cash crop is tourism. $18 billion a year in 2018. So instead of chattel slavery, agricultural activities, the Gullah Geechee people then became part and parcel of a tourist industry that had low pay, was very attentive to acquiring the property of people who were unable to pay the taxes, were very interested in overcoming such industries that were dominated by the Gullah Geechee people, like shrimping, brought in shrimp farming, and pretty much eliminated the whole industry. The other thing that happened with this new cash crop is that there is a invisible ceiling. We call it the moss ceiling. It's an invisible ceiling that only allows descendants of people like Omar, who still live in areas that used to be largely dominated by crops. They're now being dominated by tourism. Every time you go into a welcome center, you can find brochures in great numbers that have sweetgrass baskets on them, Gullah Geechee people on them with rags around their heads, aprons, all pushing the Gullah culture. But the Gullah people still remain in poverty, and their property, their historic land, remains to be predatory, in terms of tourism, hotels, motels, and that kind of thing. So Omar may have come to this area during that time when a cash crop was one thing, but it never left. It has changed over the years, and today tourism tells us what about our history is going to be publicized or considered important. If they decide that they're only going to put forth our singing skills, our clapping skills, our basket weaving skills, all other forms of talent that may have come out of that, the descendants of Omar and people who were his, what they call homies, that is dictated by an industry, not by the people themselves. These people come into the communities to write books and to learn about the Gullah Geechee people, but leave with these kinds of limited interpretations of us. I call it partial truths. They just get a partial bit of it that sells on the tourism plane, and that's what happens. So I submit that the descendants of that same history that Mamarame is talking about, we're still enslaved, we're still hindered, and we're still dictated to by an industry that relies on our culture, our history, and our heritage for the benefit of the rich.
Well, to that end, after putting together what John, Mamarame, and you, Veronica, shared here, before we go into, I guess, some of a question answering from those in the audience, how do we as historians that are gathered here, there's three of us, or four of us here on this call here, how do we articulate very clearly in a loud voice, in a political voice, to the communities that may be being trampled on or being taken advantage of or being suspect to this without their knowledge, in a way that they perhaps can be removed, in a way that the shackles can be removed from them. Because to be honest, Veronica, I've heard this often. And I'll be transparent. I'm grateful to what Nigel said. I guess I never thought of myself as the father of the Gullah Geechee Culture Heritage Corridor, but that's what he just said here this evening publicly. But I have to say, sometime when I reflect on the work that went to establish that, and I'm grateful for that picture that you were able to show of us putting up the Gullah Geechee Culture Heritage Corridor sign in Horry County, leading toward Myrtle Beach. I think that's great. But a small part of me also realized that there's some tragic natures that have crept up and been personified because of this. So I guess I'm sharing something inside that I probably don't talk about publicly. So how do we deal with that?
I can chime in very briefly. I think, especially here in Charleston, in a city that was wealthy and profitable simply because of the exploitation of enslaved labor, we could do a better job at educating those who come here to enjoy this city of its dark history. I think it is a failure in some circumstances that there is not a memorial to the enslaved population, that there is not better public history educating people in the streets of what happened in certain locations. And, I think recommending and publicizing materials for people to educate themselves. I think one of the better books I've read recently about Charleston's history and on this topic is Denmark Vesey's Garden by Ethan Kittle and Blaine Roberts, and they talk about history and memory in the capital of slavery in the South. So these are things that we have to deal with over time and try to educate people and also reconcile with the dark history of the Low Country.
I think too, we concentrate a lot on teaching history in an episodic way. Children are still learning history in terms of dates, names, rather than seeing a story that may have begun with someone like Omar being kidnapped or taken away. That's a chapter in a story that comes all the way down to my generation, Michael's generation, where we're still in it. So I think we may have to look at teaching history in a more narrative way, as opposed to these random episodes and memorizing who was the first to do this and who was the first to do that. I think that really pigeonholes it and kind of keeps it in these little pegs where you only talk in February about certain things.
Well, I think that leads me to where we are now in November of 2020. That's COVID-19 and the pandemic that our nation and our world is facing. And given all that we've talked about the Senegambia region and Senegal tonight, how is the land of Omar weathering itself in terms of COVID-19? Have people been displaced, death, sickness? Just maybe, explain how that's affected the world in which you're in now at this hour of the morning.
So you would be surprised, but we are doing wonderfully well with the COVID-19 in Senegal. To date, we have 15,720 positive cases, including 15,366 cured. So with only 326 deaths and 27 that are still under treatment. So we've done a great job to control, to educate people, to control the pandemic. Senegal ranked second among countries that are coping best with the coronavirus pandemic. But the crisis impacted badly the economy, employment, and religion. Hotels, travel companies, small businesses such as restaurants, clubs were heavily affected. So they all closed since March, and they are just reopening very slowly today. So many young Senegalese lost their jobs and cannot find any. So, and as a result, they attempt to emigrate to Europe, riding those river boats that John talked about earlier. Many of them died in the throughout this trip, in the Atlantic Ocean. So, also during the pandemic, mosques and churches were closed as a way to fight against the spread of the virus. And that thing led to some opposition sometimes because, as you know, Senegal is a very religious country. So 95% of the population is Muslim, 4% is Christian, mainly Catholics, and 100% followers of traditional religion. But they are all faithful to their religion, and they practice on a daily basis. So, but today, given the decrease of the numbers, the cases, so mosques and churches are reopening, even though some are still closed for the Friday prayer, which usually gathers a lot of people. And small businesses are recovering with the help of the government. So, but we're doing, generally speaking, we're doing pretty well compared to some other places in the world.
And if I can speak to other pandemic that's happening here in America, and that's our social change that we're under. And I'm sure you all in Senegal are aware of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Aubrey, from the Gullah Corridor itself. How have Senegalese looked at that in the context of this whole conversation?
Let me just tell you that we've been following quite on a regular basis, like daily, what is happening today. The U.S. election. I was invited in on television to comment on the what is happening right now and try to understand why the country is moving towards this direction. So if you come to the new museum, the Black Civilization Museum, you will see a big picture of Floyd, there. So people were very were moved and affected by what was happening during those days, and added to that the effect of the pandemic in the U.S. So because the U.S. and Senegal are partners in many ways, there's so many people, so many Americans coming to Senegal through programs, study abroad programs, or visiting, the Gore Island, the new monument, Saint Louis, etc. So we are one people, and whatever hurts you would also hurt us. And we've been following closely what is happening, and we hope that you will be able to use all the available resources that you have to make the country reunited and go through this tough time.
Okay. And to that, John, you said that you have a focus looking at the environmental aspect of both sides of the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. Maybe if you can kind of talk a little bit quickly about, I know we have a flooding issue here often in the Low Country, and how that maybe tie into what may be happening in Senegal here from a historical, cultural, environmental perspective. So.
Yeah, I mean, and Mamarame, you could probably speak to this probably better are you a Dakarois? I'm not sure if you grew up in Dakar.
Yes, I grew up in Dakar.
Right, and I don't think in the way of flooding that Dakar really experiences the same type of tidal flooding, although, you know, the torrential rains can cause some serious problems in Dakar during the rainy season. But I think really the connection is between climate change and what it's doing to both areas, right? And since, you know, flooding is certainly part of climate change here in the Low Country, climate change in Senegal is wreaking havoc in other ways. And one of the big projects that you know, all of you in the audience or anyone wants to look into is what we call the Great Green Wall of the Sahara. And it's this project to stop desertification and the encroachment of the Sahara Desert into the savannah. So kind of, you know, where Omar lived, right up in the Futatoro area, places like that. And while the science behind desert encroachment is controversial, the project has continued. And what's really interesting up there is they're planning hopefully a wall of trees. This is a international project, a wall of trees from Senegal all the way to Djibouti, and it's about 15 kilometers wide. And like I said, it's designed to stop the encroachment of the desert. But since the science is kind of murky, a lot of countries have abandoned this kind of climate change narrative and have now focused more on a development and humanitarian aid narrative. And it really has shown some success in northern Senegal. I'm not sure, Mamarame, if you've seen some of the villages that have taken this project on. But it is promising, and it's great to see Senegal be super proactive about climate change. And then I'll also end with, you know, the other thing that I study, which is energy in Africa. Senegal is becoming a renewable energy leader in the world. I think at times it's 15 to 20% of their electricity comes from solar. And they're also designing new renewable energies. So they're kind of leapfrogging the dirty fossil fuel infrastructure that we've got for the last 200 years and designing new renewable energy programs. So it's really exciting stuff to see, you know, an African country that does not have the piggy bank that we do, but being a bit more progressive with its climate.
Exactly. So as you said, we've been harassed by this flooding this year because we experienced something that hasn't happened for a very long time. We have heavy rains and people were displaced, and all this happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that made things, you know, tougher and, you know, hard to handle. So, but now we are entering the dry season. So people who were displaced rejoined their houses, and as you said, there are multiple initiatives that, you know, that are geared towards, you know, bringing electricity to the villages that, you know, were in darkness for many years. And also reforestation is also something that is going on. So energy is also one of our main you know, project. Today we just discovered oil and gas in the coastal region of Senegal. So we are hopeful that you know, in the next few years, Senegal will be exporting oil to the region and be independent and self-sufficient in energy.
Veronica, I know that you are a connoisseur and an excellent cook. So to that effect, let's talk a little about jollof rice and how did it get its name, and does it really taste like low country red rice? Because you've been fortunate enough, at least I know, at least in this year, to have eaten on both sides of the Atlantic.
That's right.
So maybe talk a little bit about a gal from Brook Green and the rice that you had along the Waccamaw and things that your mom placed in you that you still try to partake of now in a cultural historic cuisine way.
You know, it's really interesting that you put it that way, because cooking is creative. That's why our food is so different. Well, it's not now, but in the early times, because we were able to create good tasting stuff out of nothing. And rice was a kind of staple. It still is. When I went to Africa last year, if I closed my eyes and didn't hear anybody talk, I would have sworn that my mother cooked everything on the table. Everything. When I went to Oklahoma, when I was at the Penn Center, we went to Oklahoma because of the Seminole Indian connection. Same thing. They cooked for us. If I could close my eyes, the jollof rice would have been the same rice my mother cooked. My point being that rice is that dish that you can use as a creative point. And I think jollof, just what happened to it once it came on this side of the Atlantic, we just changed the vegetables for meats, used the meat stock, and created from there. We are masters at the one pot cooking. We still do it. It's the one culture where you can have everything cooked in one pot, and it's all different. You can have the meat, the vegetables, the corn, it's just different things all in the one pot, 7 different things together. And they don't always have to be connecting to the ordinary person, but when you put it together in that one pot, my grandmother used to say that that's what make them jine together. Mamarame, jine, we take some certain vowels out. You were talking about the language. So instead of saying join with the OI, we say jine.
Okay.
Or instead of saying boil, we say bile.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to bile something. Mm-hmm. So just those kind of connections. But yeah, food is really a whole different panel. It is the one place where we could talk culture all day because it's the one thing that's handed down almost unchangeable. Because it is the taste that is preserved by the old heads. When they sent the recipe down, it was the taste you aspired for, not so much the ingredients.
And Brother Seck, I guess you want to chime in on bile.
Yeah.
Do y'all say bile? Mamarame, do you say bile? Bile the water?
Boil the water.
Yeah.
Yes, we say boil. Yes, boil.
Oh, y'all do the OI.
Yeah, boil. And boil means to make fire, but also like to heat up. Boil.
Okay.
Yeah, boil. So, can you, Michael, please bring back that map? Because I wanted to show people where the name jollof rice came from. If you look at the Futatoro, it borders with 2 big kingdoms, the Kayor on the left and the Jollof
in the middle.
In the middle. So, and then you have the Bundu area that borders with Futatoro, which is the area where, Omar was captured. So that Jollof kingdom gave its name to that rice dish called chebujen, which you call jollof rice. And speaking of language, I forgot to mention the th sound, the sound that does not exist in African languages, and that is why people switch to plosives like a t, the t sound, or d sound, and in at the beginning, but also at the end of words, like we say buff, buff, instead of buff, or you would see I think, I think, and not I think, those are remnants of African languages that came into English. So one thing that that characterizes us as linguists, that we never make fun of people because they mispronounce something, or they don't use agreement. There is always an explanation of that. It could be phonological, it could be historical, it could be, so that is really how we look at, Ebonics and other varieties of English, spoken in the state. So I think there's a need to dig into that and find more examples and explanation of some of the of the things that are happening in the language.
Good. Well, I guess this gets us ready to go and eat now. But I would like those who may be in our audience tonight that really heard a wealth of history, information, just good stuff, good thing, as we often say. If you would take advantage of this opportunity, please, and just share any questions that you all may have. That's why we're gathered here together. We join up together. So please, in all honesty and seriousness, we do humbly ask if you have any questions about it, please let us know.
That's right.
We don't know what you think.
Well, while you're waiting for them, did we get a question?
Yeah, I guess the question is there currently a significant population of Senegalese people in the United States, specifically in the South, and how does that compare to the 18th and 19th centuries? That's a John and Mamarame question.
I think there is a large Senegalese population now in the U.S. and it goes from north to south, east to west. So I think every big city that you take in the U.S., you will find a lot of Senegalese. The question is, why do they want to settle in big cities and not in the in the rural areas? So those who come to the U.S. to settle, they are those who in Senegal would also come to the city to do business and make money. So I think going to New York from Dakar is just a continuation of that journey. From a city like in Diourbel or Fatick or any other region inside the country to Dakar, which offers more jobs and opportunities. So when they come to the U.S., they also go to New York, to San Francisco, or big cities where they can expect to have jobs and more opportunities. But there are a lot. And if you go to New York, there is little Senegal there. You go to Atlanta, you have a lot of a large community of Senegalese, and also you can also find mosques, places especially built by the Murids, who are also widely present in the U.S. So you would see Tuba, Atlanta, Tuba, New York, Tuba, California. So those are places that Murids gather when they come to the U.S. And those are also places where they can talk to each other, help each other, and support and help each other find opportunities in the city where they just arrive.
John, you about to add something before I move on?
Yeah, I can add a few things real quickly. I spent 8 years in graduate school in Chicago, and there was a massive community of Senegalese there. I don't know why they chose the coldest place on the planet to settle.
Chicago.
That was their prerogative. But yeah, I was just going to comment too that, you know, the Marine Brotherhood really has a large presence, not only in the United States, but internationally. And it's kind of part of who they are to collect money and send it back to Tuba. So you'll see them pretty much in every corner of the United States. As far as Charleston, you know, I haven't been able to locate a really robust Senegalese community yet. I've run into many Senegalese people, but you know, I'm still on the search for some good Cheikh. And
yeah, they're in the braid shops.
Yeah,
they have braiding shops.
Right.
A lot of Senegalese women in Charleston.
Oh, wow.
And in Colombia, they are master braiders. I know Mamarame was talking a little bit about that, but they're master braiders and
yes,
highly sought after. So they're working people. You know, so you'd have to go to the braid shops. You'll find everybody you need in there, and their husbands come by, and the neighbors come by. It's a whole community. Find the hair braiding shop.
Well,
yes.
you know, we had some chat conversation with some of our audience, and they wanted you, Veronica and Mamarame, to kind of talk about words that are in Gullah culture and in Wolof that may be similar. So you all can maybe have a dialogue of Geechee Wolof, so to speak. Not a battle or anything like that. Okay?
I saw Yarboy. It reminds me of a fish like that is very tasty, small, not very expensive. That, you know, people, especially in that Futatoro region, because those who live along the coast can afford to have big fish for the Chebujan, but as you go inside the country, you would see lesser, you know, amount of fish, and people would just use this type of fish, which is also used for tuna and other, you know, sardines that you may have. So it's very tasty. So I think in music also you have like in jazz you have words like dig, dig, dig. You dig me, you dig it. So dig means to hear. Do you hear? Do you hear me? So we have also in hip hop. I heard someone Ashanti who was teaching. I think at Temple University in Philadelphia, I think. I heard him one day give examples. It was in North Carolina about hippie coming, the hip hop coming from hippie in Wolof. That means to open one's eyes. So so there are. I'm sure there are other examples. Talk, for example, talk means to smoke. You know, talk. That is also, I think, a word that is related to English. Who that was taken from Wolof, from the Senegambian region. So, yeah, I'm sure there are examples. But what struck me really was the syntax of the language, the grammar of the language. So that was really something that struck me, and I think we have a lot to say about it. So to understand why English is spoken the way it is in certain areas and by certain people, you know, who are from of African descent.
One thing I thought about is in Gullah, we don't necessarily have to use the verb to be. What about you? For instance, in standard English, it would be he is going.
Yes.
In Gullah, you don't need the is. He going. He cute. He ugly.
Of course.
So the verb to be is not really necessary.
Yeah, because it is conjugated and it bears some agreement features, and that is not important. That is not something you know, prominent in African languages. ugly is a word, you know, so it has to be there, and the pronoun, you know, is also does have to be there. So but the is not necessary. So that's why we have those. And even in Wolof, you know, only the what we call the inflections, so bear agreement. So but the root verbs don't, you know. And I was speaking of double negation. I forgot to give you an example. If you say hamuma chi dara, that means I don't know nothing about it. You see, in Wolof, or demuma fen, I don't go nowhere, instead of I don't go anywhere. So you see, that is something I think that is very striking, you know, when looking at similarities between Ebonics, for example, and Wolof. So I think there is some research, as John mentioned it. I think this is a great opportunity to kind of educate people, but also give them, you know, some avenues of research where they can go and look at, you know, do the job themselves to kind of find things that may be relevant to their life or interest. So
I want to end with you, Veronica, because you touched on this early on, that infusion of Islam and Christianity and what you saw and experienced. So how do you feel the traditions of Muslim, how they have evolved with slaves who were converted into Christianity as a part of the plantation system, this introspection or intersection, if you will?
Well, you know, I thought about that, and it's interesting you asked. We did not differentiate in the ways that people would think that you did. They just were known as those people. They were still part of our village, but they were known as, you know, those people go in the woods to pray. That's how they would be referred to. Or, you know, she don't ever uncover her hair. Or, you know, they don't eat anything but fish. So they didn't necessarily distinguish them based on them being Islam. They distinguished them as being like us with those additions, if that makes any sense.
Okay. It was understood.
Yeah, it was understood that well, you know, you can't go to Miss Mary's house on Friday.
Okay.
You know, we just embraced it, and everybody got along. Because when I was thinking about Omar, and we're talking about how amazing it is for him to have maintained his belief system, but it's very, very common on this side of the Atlantic to be able to have strong belief in Christianity, but believe other things at the same time without any conflict. I think I mentioned before, in the early narratives, you find that a lot of the root doctors and the ministers were one and the same. So you could be a Christian and also embrace an inherited traditional belief as well.
Well, I want to say on behalf of the panelists that are here, Mamarame Seck from Senegal early this morning, and John Cropper here in the Low Country, and Veronica up in Conway, and to the staff connected with Spoleto, we just want to say thank you for spending this well-spent time with us here, looking at Omar and the world that he lived and evolved in, and how what he saw and experienced is still part of our landscape in the 21st century. So again, we want to thank everyone for joining us here. As you know, this is a part of a series of conversation, and there will be others coming up in the near future as well that will continue to explore Omar. But again, on behalf of all of the panelists and staff here, we want to say thank you. Good evening, good morning to you again, Mamarame, while you're doing what's left of your morning in Senegal. And again, thank you to everyone that's here. We're grateful and we thank you for what you have done to make this possible. Good night.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.